A grown man in Beskar armor, the most feared bounty hunter in the Outer Rim, stood in a Klatooinian slaughterhouse on the Glavis Ringworld and sliced open his own thigh with a lightsaber he was supposed to control. Din Djarin had fought Imperial Dark Troopers without flinching, stared down Moff Gideon with a Beskar spear, and walked away alive. And yet, here he was, bleeding from a self-inflicted wound because the blade in his hand had twisted against him at the exact moment he needed it to obey. Every other lightsaber in Star Wars is a tool, but the Darksaber is something else entirely, and the reason it is 10 times more dangerous than any other blade in the galaxy has almost nothing to do with how it cuts. His name was Tarre Vizsla, and his existence should not have been possible. The Jedi Order and the Mandalorian people had been at each other's throats for centuries. Generations of warriors on both sides had grown up hearing the same lessons in the same words. The Jedi were sorcerers who cannot be trusted, and the Mandalorians were warlords who cannot be reasoned with. The two peoples fought the kind of wars that leave memory scars on entire cultures, and children were raised to distrust the other side before they had met anyone from it. And then, sometime around 1,050 years before the fall of the Empire, a Force-sensitive Mandalorian child was taken into the Jedi Order. As far as the surviving Jedi records show, no Mandalorian had been accepted before, and none would be accepted again. Tarre Vizsla walked into the temple on Coruscant as the first and only member of his people to wear Jedi robes, and he did not simply survive the transition. He rose through the ranks, became a Jedi Knight, and then did something no Jedi in 1,000 generations of recorded history had done before. He built a lightsaber that came out black. The hilt was Mandalorian. Tarre did not build a standard cylinder of alloy, he shaped a curved, ornate handle of Beskar, the near-indestructible Mandalorian metal engraved with the patterns of his people. The blade itself was the part that broke the rules. Every lightsaber in the Jedi tradition is built the same way. A young Jedi travels to the planet Ilum and undergoes a ceremony called the Gathering, where they bond with a kyber crystal in the ice caves. The crystal chooses them, the bond runs through the Force, and when the saber is finished, the blade color reflects that bond. Blue and green for the most common Jedi paths, yellow for the Sentinels and the Temple Guards, purple for the rare warrior like Mace Windu, who walked a line between paths. White is when a crystal has been purified of corruption. Red is when a crystal has been forced into submission through a dark side ritual called bleeding. Every documented color in the catalog has an explanation rooted in the Force, the Jedi, or the Sith. However, black does not, and it should not exist. The Darksaber's crystal was not corrupted. It never touched the dark side. It was not bled because Tarre was a Jedi Knight in good standing when he built the weapon, surrounded by other Jedi inside their own temple. Whatever he was carrying when he walked into that ice cave, whatever combination of two heritages collided inside him at the Gathering, the Force responded with a color that had no category. He left the cave holding a blade no Jedi had ever seen, and no Jedi would ever see again. Over 1,000 years of Jedi history, before and after Tarre Vizsla, the catalog of kyber crystals across the entire galaxy contains exactly one black crystal, and it was his. It has its own physics, its own ownership rules, and a logic no Jedi or Sith weapon was ever supposed to have. When Tarre Vizsla died, the Jedi Order kept the Darksaber inside their temple on Coruscant. They treated it the way they treated every relic, carefully, respectfully, and behind locked doors. The Mandalorians saw that decision differently. To them, the blade was not a Jedi artifact, it was a Mandalorian heirloom being held hostage. During a period of political collapse in the Old Republic, members of House Vizsla, Tarre's own clan, broke into the Jedi Temple and took the Darksaber back. They called it Liberation. They carried the blade home to Mandalore and used it to unite the clans under the banner of the Vizsla name. From that point forward, the Darksaber did not belong to any one Jedi or any one Mandalorian. It belonged to whoever was strong enough to hold it. Standard lightsabers produce a rounded blade of plasma held together by a magnetic field that hums and glows steadily. When they meet another Jedi blade, they push against it, creating that locked, sparking clash that every Jedi and every dark side practitioner learns to read. Generations of warriors have built their entire combat grammar around that predictable push. The way blades lock, the way pressure redirects, the way a shove becomes a counterstrike. The Darksaber does not follow that grammar. Its blade is flat, short, and tapered to a point, shaped less like a column of plasma and more like an ancient steel sword. When it ignites, the hum runs higher and sharper than any other blade in the galaxy, and the air whistles around it as it moves. The sound fills the room and sets every nerve on edge before the first swing even lands. And when its blade meets another lightsaber blade, it does not push away, it pulls. The Darksaber draws other blades towards itself with something fighters have described as a magnetic attraction, and that single property rewrites the physics of every duel it enters. A trained duelist facing the Darksaber for the first time will instinctively expect the push they have trained against their entire life. They will get the pull instead. That fraction of a second confusion, that tiny betrayal of muscle memory, is often enough to turn a fighter who should win into a fighter who loses. The Darksaber attacks the wielder's opponent not with its edge, but with their own training. Then there's Beskar. Mandalorian armor is one of the only materials in the galaxy that can stop a lightsaber clean. The Darksaber breaks that rule too. Its blade heats Beskar past the point anyone wearing it wants to hold still. Against the one thing built to protect Mandalorians from blades, the Darksaber finds a way through. The real danger of the Darksaber is not what it does to the person it is being swung at. It is what it does to the person swinging it. When the Mandalorian warrior Sabine Wren first picked up the Darksaber during the Imperial era, she described it as heavier than it looked. Her Jedi teacher, Canon and Legends, watched her struggle with the blade and gave her one of the strangest pieces of combat advice ever given in Star Wars. He did not tell her to try harder. He did not tell her to swing faster. He told her to stop fighting the blade and start understanding it. Canon explained that the crystal inside the Darksaber was constantly charged. The wielder was not simply swinging a weapon, they were directing a current of energy, and every thought, every feeling, and every unresolved conflict in the wielder's mind flowed into that crystal and became part of the blade. Every lightsaber bonds with its wielder to some degree through the Force. The Darksaber takes that bond to a dimension no other weapon reaches. It feels the person holding it, and it responds to what it feels. When the wielder carries unresolved weight, the Darksaber becomes physically heavier, not as a metaphor, but as a measurable fact that changes how the blade handles in combat. A warrior in emotional conflict finds it sluggish and resistant, while a warrior who is mentally clear finds it responsive and alive. The blade makes no distinction between the kind of inner weight a good person carries and the kind a bad person carries. It does not measure virtue, it measures certainty. That is why Din Djarin burned himself on the Glavis ring world. He was a bounty hunter of extraordinary skill, trained in armor and blades since childhood, and yet the moment he tried to use the Darksaber in a real fight, it turned on him. His mind was not on the opponent in front of him, it was on Grogu, the Force-sensitive child he had given up to Luke Skywalker. It was on the leadership role he had never asked for and did not believe he deserved. It was on the weight of holding a symbol he felt he had not earned. The Darksaber felt every single one of those unresolved knots, became heavier in response, and when the bounty hunter tried to pivot through a crowded room of thugs, the blade did not go where he wanted it to go. It cut across his leg instead. The armorer, the spiritual leader of his tribe, told him something no lightsaber instructor in the Jedi Order would ever have said. She told him he was fighting against the blade when he should have been fighting against his opponent. Strength, she said, could never control it, only clarity could. Tarre Vizsla faced the same problem from the opposite direction. Paz was larger, stronger, and a descendant of Tarre Vizsla himself. By every measure of entitlement, the Darksaber belonged to him. But when he challenged Din for the blade, the same dynamic that had crippled the bounty hunter crippled Paz too. His resentment, his anger, his desperate need to reclaim something he felt his family had been robbed of, translated directly into the blade becoming unwieldy in his hands. A man whose bloodline had carried the Darksaber for generations found he could not carry it for a single duel because the weight he was carrying in his chest became the weight the Darksaber added to his arm. Bloodline did not save Paz. Skill did not save Din. The Darksaber tested something deeper than either of them had brought into the fight, and they both failed the test in front of everyone who was watching. The clearest proof of what the Darksaber actually rewards came from two people who should never have been able to wield it, and yet did. Tarre Vizsla was the leader of Death Watch, a Mandalorian faction that rejected the pacifist government of the new Mandalorians and wanted to restore the old warrior ways. He was not Force sensitive, he had no Jedi training, he was a man in armor with a blade and a cause. and during the Clone Wars, he took that blade to the moon of Concordia and drew it against Obi-Wan Kenobi, one of the finest duelists the Jedi Order had ever produced. Everyone who had watched that fight expected a quick, one-sided result. Tarre Vizsla held his own long enough to prove everyone wrong. Kenobi eventually gained the upper hand, and the Death Watch leader only escaped because his warriors stepped in. But the fact that the fight was close at all was the first shock. A non-Force user, armed with the Darksaber and absolute conviction in his cause, could make a Jedi Master work for a victory that should have come easily. Then there was the Zabrak who changed the rules. Maul, the fallen Sith apprentice who had survived being cut in half by Kenobi years earlier, allied with Tarre Vizsla during the Clone Wars in a plan to overthrow Mandalore. The plan succeeded. The Death Watch leader then betrayed the former Sith, throwing him in prison rather than sharing power. Maul broke out, returned to the Sundari throne room, and challenged Vizsla to single combat for the throne. Bound by the warrior tradition he had built his entire faction around, Vizsla had to accept. Maul struck him down with the Darksaber and claimed it as his own, becoming the first non-Mandalorian to take the blade in combat. By every tradition Mandalorian culture held sacred, this should not have worked. Maul was an outsider who shared none of their heritage, none of their creed, and none of their history. He was a former Sith apprentice from Dathomir, raised in servitude and burning resentment by the man who would become Emperor. And yet, the Darksaber performed for the Zabrak exactly as well as it had for the bloodline that built it, because the blade did not reject him. It recognized what he carried. What Maul had that the Darksaber responded to was certainty. He had spent his entire life being stripped of doubt. Sidious had trained it out of him from childhood. Suffering had burned it out of him in exile, and revenge had focused him on a single point. The former Sith walked into every room having already decided the outcome, and the Darksaber rewarded that completely. The Darksaber responded to one thing only: total unwavering conviction. A Mandalorian consumed with self-doubt cannot make the blade move. A stranger consumed with purpose can. Mandalorian culture enshrined one rule about the Darksaber that overrode every other consideration: the blood could change hands only through combat. The rightful owner was whoever had defeated the previous owner in a fair duel, not the person who inherited it, not the person who found it, not the person who was given it as a gift. The Darksaber belonged to the victor, and that rule was not a formality. It was the mechanism by which the Mandalorian people decided who had the right to rule them. The blade was never just a weapon on Mandalore, it was the symbol of authority over all the clans. Whoever held the Darksaber, having won it in a duel, carried the obligation and the right to unite the Mandalorian people under a single banner. Tarre Vizsla himself had done it 1,000 years before. The blade had carried that legacy forward across generations, and in a culture built around martial excellence, the Darksaber mattered more than any bloodline, any rank, any political title, which is exactly why it kept toppling governments. When Maul struck down Tarre Vizsla in single combat, Mandalorian law declared him the rightful ruler of Mandalore. A Zabrak former Sith, an outsider with no ties to the planet, technically held sovereign authority over an entire civilization because the blade's own rules said he did. Mandalorians could reject that outcome and refuse to follow him, but by the logic of their own tradition, he had won, and the tradition did not care who he was. Darth Sidious soon arrived at the Sundari royal palace to deal with his rogue apprentice personally. In the duel that followed, the Dark Lord defeated Maul and knocked the Darksaber from his hand. The blade was later recovered from the palace floor and eventually returned to the Zabrak, who took it with him when he went into hiding. Sidious never claimed the throne of Mandalore, never wielded the Darksaber in any public ceremony, and never treated the weapon as anything more than an inconvenient detail in a larger game. The Emperor of the Galaxy held the symbol of Mandalorian sovereignty for about 5 minutes and discarded it, because with the Death Star, the Inquisitors, and Darth Vader already at his command, a single black blade on an Outer Rim planet was a footnote. Moff Gideon treated the same blade very differently. The Imperial officer came into possession of the Darksaber through one of the ugliest moments in Mandalorian history. During the final stages of the Great Purge of Mandalore, Bo-Katan Kryze, then the ruler of her people, met with Gideon to negotiate a ceasefire. The terms were simple and stark. She would surrender the Darksaber and disarm her forces, and in exchange, the remaining Mandalorian cities and lives would be spared. She agreed and gave up the blade. Gideon broke the deal the moment he had what he wanted, continuing the Purge until the surface of Mandalore was a wasteland and the Mandalorian people were scattered across the galaxy. Gideon did not win the Darksaber in a duel, he extracted it through a lie, but the Imperial understood something about the weapon that most of its previous owners had not. He understood that as long as he held it, no Mandalorian leader could unite the surviving clans, because the one symbol their culture recognized as proof of legitimate authority was in the hands of the enemy. He did not use the Darksaber to rule Mandalore, he used it to make sure no one else could. The woman who handed the blade over to Gideon had once been the natural choice to hold it. Bo-Katan Kryze came from one of the most respected bloodlines on Mandalore. She had fought in the Clone Wars on the side of Death Watch, then turned against Maul when his ambitions became clear. She had spent her entire adult life trying to pull her people back from the cycle of violence Death Watch had unleashed. Years before the Purge, when the young Mandalorian Sabine Wren recovered the blade from Maul's old stronghold on Dathomir and brought it back to the Mandalorian clans, she chose Bo-Katan as the leader who could unite them. She held the Darksaber out and ordered it as a gift. Bo-Katan accepted. That single moment, framed as a victory for Mandalore, was the seed of everything that came after. Bo-Katan knew the law of the blade. Every Mandalorian child knew it. The Darksaber changed hands through combat, or it changed hands wrongly, and there was no third option. Watching her people fractured and outnumbered and running out of time, she took the blade anyway, because the alternative was waiting for a duel that might never come while the Empire kept eating her civilization piece by piece. She made the most reasonable possible decision and the most wrong possible decision in the same breath. The clans followed her at first. She led them through the early resistance, through skirmishes against Imperial garrisons, through years of trying to rebuild something Mandalore could call sovereign again. And then the Purge came. The clans began to splinter, and the warriors who had once trusted her began to whisper that she had never truly held a blade in the first place. When she met Gideon at the end of that road and surrendered the Darksaber for a ceasefire that was never going to be honored, the warriors who had been whispering had their answer. The blade had not been earned. The leadership it gave was not real. The disaster that followed was not just an Imperial victory, it was a verdict. Bo-Katan would spend the next several years trying to earn what she had skipped. She would refuse the blade when Din Djarin tried to give it to her after defeating Gideon, because she had already learned what gifts cost. She would walk through the ruins of her own home world looking for a fight that would put the blade back in her hand the right way. And eventually, in the final season of The Mandalorian, she would get that fight. She would win it, and the clans would accept her at last. But the entire arc of her life, from the day Sabine first held out the blade, was the cost of that one moment of acceptance. The Darksaber forgave conviction, it did not forgive shortcuts. Bo-Katan was the proof. The version of this story most fans know is the canon timeline, the chain of ownership that runs from Tarre Vizsla through to Bo-Katan's final duel. But there is another timeline. The Legends continuity, the vast library of stories told before Lucasfilm reset the canon in 2014, ran the Darksaber through a different set of hands and a different war. And while the names changed, the shape of the lesson did not. In Legends, the blade ran through Death Watch decades before the Clone Wars. The faction's founder, Tarre Vizsla, broke from his people when a man named Jester Muriel took the title of Mandalore and tried to reform them through a code that asked Mandalorians to act as honorable mercenaries rather than as conquerors. Tarre rejected it, built Death Watch as the answer, and carried the Darksaber as the verdict. Where Tarre Vizsla had built the blade to bridge two cultures, Tarre wielded it to defend one against the man trying to change it. The civil war that followed lasted years and killed thousands, including Muriel himself, where his own second-in-command abandoned him on the field and Death Watch closed in. The blade the first Mandalorian Jedi had built now belonged to the man who had hunted down the Mandalorian, trying hardest to make his people something better. The lesson the Darksaber teaches in canon, that conviction wins regardless of cause, was the lesson Legends had taught first and taught uglier. Across both timelines, written decades apart by different writers, no second Black Crystal ever appears. It only ever happened once. Across 8 wielders and a single blade, the chain of ownership that runs from Tarre Vizsla to Bo-Katan's final duel is the longest unbroken history any lightsaber has ever had. And inside that chain sits the strangest fact about the Darksaber. It does not care whether the wielder is good. Maul and Gideon were not good. Yet both held the blade effectively because both were psychologically resolved, free of the internal conflict that turns the weapon into a liability against its own user. Sabine, who was good, carried the guilt of designing a super weapon for the Empire and could barely move the blade until she faced that guilt directly. Din, who was good, could not carry it at all while his mind was on the child he had given away. The Darksaber was destroyed at the end of the 3rd season of The Mandalorian, crushed in the grip of Moff Gideon's strength-enhanced armor during his final confrontation with Bo-Katan. 1,000 years of Mandalorian history ended in a single moment of deliberate annihilation, and Gideon did not just defeat Bo-Katan, he tried to erase the symbol she was fighting for. Whether the Darksaber returns in some future form remains unknown. The Mandalorian people still exist, their tradition still holds, and in Star Wars, the most meaningful things rarely stay gone. But what the blade left behind is a standard no other lightsaber has ever set, a weapon that already knew everything about the person holding it and demanded they know themselves just as well. Every other lightsaber color the galaxy ever produced, from the blue and green of the Jedi to the red of the Sith and the rare white of the Redeemed, has its own history and its own meaning. That full breakdown is waiting for you next. And the warriors whose creed shaped every duel the Darksaber ever entered, the people whose entire civilization revolved around a single blade, they get the deep dive they deserve right after that.